Mom, please help me. My daughter sobbed as she stood at my doorstep in the middle of the night. She had only been married for 3 months, and now, without any warning, she was here, in tears. My heart sank. What could have possibly happened? When I saw her face, it was swollen, bruised, and battered. I was utterly speechless, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. My beautiful daughter, who was always so full of life, had been reduced to this. I listened as she told me her story, and the more I heard, the more anger bubbled inside me. This was beyond cruel. It was unforgivable. How could this happen? What happened to his promise to make her happy? Every word he had spoken felt like a lie now. I made a vow that night. I was going to get revenge on the people who hurt my daughter. They were going to pay for what they did to her. Let me introduce myself. I'm Marlo, and I'm 49 years old. I divorced when my daughter, Brielle, was still very young, and ever since, I've raised her by myself while working full-time. Brielle has always been a quiet and reserved girl, but she has a strong heart. She's tough, resilient, and a hard worker. Despite the challenges, she always pushed through, and because of her determination, she landed a job at the company she had dreamed of working for. Brielle has always been the light in my life, the reason I kept going even when things got tough. So, when she told me, "Mom, there's someone I want you to meet," my heart fluttered with excitement. The man she introduced me to was named Keaton. He worked for one of her company's clients, and he was 7 years older than Brielle. He looked sharp in his suit and greeted me with a bright smile. At first glance, he seemed like a serious and dependable man. After exchanging a few pleasantries, he surprised me by saying, "I've come today to ask for your blessing to marry Brielle." I wasn't expecting such a bold statement, especially since Brielle was only 21, and they had been dating for just 6 months. I thought I was simply meeting her boyfriend, so this threw me off. "You're both still young," I said, trying to be gentle. "Don't you think it's a bit early to be talking about marriage?" But Keaton straightened up, looked me directly in the eyes, and said with unwavering determination, "I can't imagine my life without Brielle. She's the most wonderful woman I've ever met, and I know I'll never meet anyone like her again." Brielle, standing beside him, added, "Mom, I feel the same way. Please, give us your blessing." It was clear that their minds were already made up. What could I do but support them? Moved by Keaton's sincerity and my daughter's heartfelt request, I finally agreed. "Thank you so much," Keaton said, his face lighting up with relief. "I promise I'll make Brielle the happiest woman in the world." As I watched the two of them exchange joyful smiles, I couldn't help but smile as well. But even after Keaton left that evening, I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. Was this really the right decision? Were they rushing into this too quickly? I reminded myself that every parent feels this way when their child gets married. Maybe it was just my protective instincts acting up because, in truth, I hadn't expected my daughter to marry so soon. I kept telling myself that everything would be fine. They looked so happy together. Things moved fast after that. We met Keaton's parents, and the wedding planning started. Both Brielle and Keaton were only children, and his parents, who had always wanted a daughter, immediately adored Brielle. They seemed so thrilled at the idea of having her in their family. One day, Brielle came to me and said, "Mom, after we get married, I'm thinking about living with Keaton's parents." I was taken aback. It was clear that Keaton's parents loved her, but moving in with them so soon? "Are you sure about this?" I asked, concerned. "I've heard living with in-laws can be tough, even under the best circumstances." Brielle smiled reassuringly. "I get along well with them, and with Keaton there, I'm not worried." I trusted her. Brielle was always sincere, and she had a way of winning people over, especially her elders. Besides, their house was only a 30-minute drive from mine, so if anything ever happened, I could be there quickly. And with that, Brielle's new life as part of her in-laws' household began after the wedding. At first, I assumed Brielle was busy adjusting to her new life, but about a month after she moved in, I noticed some changes. The daily texts she used to send me suddenly stopped. Even when I messaged her, she rarely replied. I didn't want to interfere too much in her new life, but I was starting to worry. So one evening, I decided to call her. To my surprise, Keaton answered the phone. "Mother-in-law, what's going on?" he asked, sounding polite. "Can I speak to Brielle's?" I asked, eager to hear my daughter's voice. "She's in the bath right now," he said calmly. "Don't worry, she's fine." His tone was soft, yet there was something about it that made me feel uneasy, as if there was no room for me to ask further questions. Reluctantly, I ended the call without speaking to Brielle. But after that, my daughter's silence continued. There were no messages, no calls that I made up my mind. I needed to see my daughter face to face. Keaton's mother had told me I was welcome to visit any time, so I decided to go to their home on the weekend. When I arrived, I rang the doorbell and heard Keaton's mother's voice over the intercom. Her tone was unusually curt as she told me, "Brielle's out with Keaton. I'm sorry for showing up unannounced, but do you know what time they'll be back?" I asked, hoping for a more welcoming response. Instead, she sighed heavily, clearly annoyed. "You should call before coming over." "I don't know when they'll be back," she replied. Her attitude threw me off, and I left without further pressing. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Keaton and his mother didn't seem like the same people they were before the wedding. The uneasy feeling gnawed at me for days. I thought maybe I was overthinking things, but I couldn't help it. I needed to know that Brielle was okay. Desperate for reassurance, I called her workplace, hoping to at least hear some good news. What they told me, however, left me in utter shock. "Brielle resigned a while ago," they said. "We've been scrambling because she quit so suddenly." I was stunned. Brielle had worked so hard to land that job. It had been her dream for so long. We had cried tears of joy when she got the offer, and she had been so excited to juggle work and her new life. It made no sense that she would suddenly quit. Something was definitely wrong, but I didn't know what to do. Should I confront Keaton? Go to their house again? Or maybe even contact the police? 2 days after learning about Brielle's resignation, an unexpected event occurred. It was the middle of the night, around 2:30 a.m., when my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. Suspiciously, I peeked at the intercom screen. The lighting was poor, but the figure outside looked like Brielle. My heart raced as I rushed to the door. I flung it open, and there she was, my daughter, standing before me, but not as I remembered. Her face was swollen, bruised, and completely unrecognizable. "Brielle, what happened?" I gasped, my voice filled with panic. "I've been so worried. I couldn't reach you." "Mom, I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her battered face. For a moment, I was frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. Brielle, my precious daughter, was in a state I could never have imagined. I wrapped my arms around her as she sobbed uncontrollably. After what felt like hours, Brielle finally began to speak, her voice trembling. She told me that right after the wedding, Keaton had changed. His warm, loving demeanor had vanished, and he treated her like a servant. "You're here to serve us now," he had told her, and from that point on, he and his parents had treated her like a slave. I had feared something like this, but hearing the details made my blood boil. Every bruise on her body was the result of their cruelty. Keaton and his parents had done this to her. "I didn't want to worry you," Brielle said, "but I couldn't take it anymore. Seeing my daughter in such pain, I felt an overwhelming need for revenge rise within me. I couldn't stand the thought of those people getting away with what they'd done. They had promised to make her happy, but instead, they had brought her nothing but misery. In that moment, I made a silent vow. I would never forgive Keaton and his family for this. They were going to pay. For now, I focused on getting Brielle the care she needed. The next morning, I took her to the hospital to have her injuries treated. Once she was bandaged and a little more rested, I decided it was time to confront Keaton and his family. When we arrived at their house, there was chaos inside. They had clearly realized Brielle was missing. Keaton's father was the one who came to the door. The moment he saw me, his face twisted in anger. "So, you took her, did you?" he shouted. I wasn't intimidated. "Can you explain why my daughter is in this condition?" I demanded, my voice steady, but filled with fury. Standing beside me, Brielle looked small and fragile, her face still swollen, bandages covering her wounds. Seeing her like that seemed to make them nervous, especially with the neighbors nearby. Reluctantly, they let us inside. For a moment, they looked uneasy, but it didn't take long for their true colors to show. Keaton's mother glared at Brielle and spat. We were just disciplining her because she wasn't doing her duties properly. Disciplining her? I shot back. And Keaton, didn't you promise to make her happy? What happened to that? Keaton's cold response was almost too much to bear. That promise depended on her fulfilling her role as a wife, but she was too busy with her job. He looked at Brielle without a hint of remorse. That's why I submitted her resignation letter for her. My heart sank as I realized Brielle hadn't quit voluntarily. Keaton had done it behind her back. Brielle tearfully explained that she hadn't known until it was too late. Keaton had been unhappy with how much time she was spending at work, and since she often came home later than he did, he took matters into his own hands. Brielle was working hard because she loved her job, I said, barely able to contain my rage. I don't care, Keaton said dismissively. If she can't handle both, then she shouldn't work. Keaton's father chimed in, he's right. Just the other day, it took her an hour to make dinner. She can't handle simple household chores. Brielle's shoulders trembled. How could they say such things? She had tried her best. If Keaton's mother saw Brielle struggling, why didn't she step in to help? But Keaton's mother crossed her arms and said harshly, when I came here as a bride, I decided enough was enough. I needed to see Brielle face to face, no matter what. Keaton's mother had once told me I was welcome anytime, so I went to their home on a weekend, hoping to catch Brielle. When I rang the bell, Keaton's mother responded curtly over the intercom, telling me that Brielle and Keaton were out. Apologizing for showing up unannounced, I asked, do you know when they'll be back? She let out a heavy sigh and snapped, you should call before coming over. I don't know when they'll be back. Her sharp tone caught me off guard. With no choice, I left, but the feeling that something was deeply wrong lingered, gnawing at me. Keaton and his mother were acting completely different compared to before the wedding, and I couldn't ignore my growing worry. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking things, but my concern for Brielle only grew. After much deliberation, I decided to call her workplace. I was hoping to hear something that would calm my fears, but what I found out instead made my heart drop. Brielle resigned suddenly, her office told me. We've been struggling since she left without any notice. My mind raced. Brielle had worked so hard to land that job. I knew how much it meant to her. It was her dream, and she had been thrilled to balance her new life and career. It made no sense for her to quit like that. Something was terribly wrong, but I wasn't sure what to do next. Should I go back to Keaton's house? Should I involve the police? 2 nights later, just after 2:30 a.m., my doorbell rang. Startled, I peeked through the intercom screen. It was too dark to see clearly, but the figure looked like Brielle. Without wasting a second, I dashed to the door and flung it open. There she was, my daughter, but not the Brielle I remembered. Her face was swollen and covered in bruises, barely recognizable. My heart shattered. Brielle, what happened to you? I gasped, pulling her into my arms. I've been so worried. I couldn't reach you. Mom, I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling. She looked so broken, and I couldn't bear to see her like this. I held her tightly, trying to calm her down as she sobbed uncontrollably. After a long while, she finally started to speak. She told me that after the wedding, Keaton had turned into a completely different person. He told her, "You're here to serve us now," and began treating her like a servant. His parents joined in, making her life unbearable. They took away her phone to stop her from contacting me and even restrained her to prevent her from leaving the house. Brielle, hoping that Keaton might change, endured it for as long as she could. But things only got worse. They forced her to eat leftovers and barely let her use enough water to shower, claiming it was a waste of gas. When Brielle stood up for herself and told them, "This isn't right," the response was horrifying. Keaton and his parents turned violent, slapping and beating her. Brielle was covered in bruises from head to toe, and fearing for her life, she waited until they were all asleep before sneaking out and fleeing to my house. Hearing all of this, my hands shook with anger. How could they have done this to her? Before the wedding, they treated her so well, What changed? When I demanded an explanation, the three of them just smirked. Keaton spoke casually. I never really cared about making her happy. I just wanted a wife who'd obey me. I thought Brielle would be good for that. His mother sighed, adding with a sneer, she was really disappointing. But maybe she's learned her lesson now. Keaton's father chimed in. Why don't we give her another chance? And just like that, they all started laughing, as if this was some kind of joke. That was it. I couldn't hold back anymore. My blood boiled as I stared at them, seething with rage. Before I could even speak, Brielle found her voice. How dare you talk to us like that, she shouted. Keaton lunged forward, trying to grab her, but I acted quickly. I put him in a hold and pinned him to the floor, immobilizing him. He struggled against me, but I didn't budge. His parents stood there, dumbfounded. You didn't know this about me, I said, tightening my grip, but I almost made it to the Olympics for wrestling. I had to quit because of an injury, but I'm still pretty good. Keaton thrashed around, tears welling up in his eyes, but he was no match for me. When I finally let him go, he slumped to the floor, utterly defeated. I stood up, cracking my knuckles, and looked at his parents. Now, who's next? I asked, stepping toward them. They shrieked, covering their heads and trembling in fear. I sent my daughter off wishing for her happiness, I said coldly. But I will never forgive you for what you've done. All three of them shrank back as I glared at them, my presence towering over them. Brielle, standing tall beside me, followed my lead. Keaton, she said firmly, I want a divorce. She presented the divorce papers.
What?
No, Keaton shouted, his face turning red. I won't divorce you. This morning, I took Brielle to the hospital and got a medical certificate for her injuries, I said calmly. I also filed a police report. We'll be fighting this in court. At that, panic swept over their faces. Keaton and his parents started sweating profusely, their confident smirks replaced by fear. Please no. What about our reputation? They cried. Brielle shook her head in disgust. I want this divorce as soon as possible, she said. We'll see how much you regret what you've done, I added as we gathered Brielle's belongings and headed for the door. Keaton's pitiful voice echoed behind us. Wait. Please. But we didn't turn back. In the end, the divorce was finalized, and Brielle received $100,000 in compensation from Keaton. The police report was accepted, and the authorities questioned all three of them. Though they were released soon after, their house became the talk of the neighborhood, and they were shamed in their community. Keaton's actions caught up to him at work too, and he was removed from the fast track to promotion. As for Brielle, she began to heal, both physically and emotionally, and slowly started looking for a new job. As for me, I realized my life was far from over. I've even started training again because I'm ready to get back into wrestling, this time on my own terms.